The silent assassination. You know the name. RMS Titanic. It's synonymous with luxury, with tragedy, and with a single, colossal iceberg in the cold North Atlantic. For 110 years, the story you've been told is a clean narrative of nature over human arrogance. A perfect story for the history books. But that story is a lie. This isn't about a shipwreck. This is about a global coup d'etat that was finalized in 1913. It is about the creation of the Federal Reserve, the powerful private financial cartel that has controlled the world's economy for over a century. To birth that monster, they needed to clear the battlefield. They needed to execute three of the most powerful, influential men on the planet. Men who had the intellect and the billions to expose the plan, and they needed it to look like an accident. We are opening the forensic file on the most daring political assassination in human history, a hit so big they needed to sink the unsinkable ship to cover it up. Welcome to the Titanic Files. The real story begins not on the ice, but in the boardroom, J.P. Morgan's cancellation. Let's look at the man who owned the Titanic. J.P. Morgan, the White Star Line, was an asset of his conglomerate, the International Mercantile Marine. His signature ordered the construction. His engineers designed the suites, and he was scheduled to be on the maiden voyage. Morgan had a private suite specially prepared, larger than any other. His luggage was already on board. He was the king of the ship. Then, 24 hours before departure, he pulled a U-turn. He canceled his tickets, claiming his health was too fragile. The mainstream story says he stayed in France. But the reality is far more chilling. J.P. Morgan wasn't in France. He was perfectly healthy. While his ship was sinking, Morgan was vacationing at a private retreat. He wasn't sick. He was safe. He wasn't the only one. Dozens of other high-level founders of the coming Fed members of the Rothschild and Rockefeller circles also simultaneously canceled their trips. They removed their collections of priceless art hours before the ship left harbor. They knew the Titanic wasn't a maiden voyage. It was a floating coffin. And J.P. Morgan didn't cancel because he was sick. He canceled because he had booked the hit. The three obstacles to the Fed. Why did they need to kill their peers? In the first-class cabins of the Titanic, J.P. Morgan had booked his three biggest political rivals, Astor IV, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidor Straus. These men were not just passengers. They were the final three obstacles. They were gold-backed billionaires who fiercely opposed the creation of a private central bank in America. They saw through the scheme of Jekyll Island, the secret meeting in 1910 where J.P. Morgan and Paul Warburg had drafted the Federal Reserve Act. Astor and Straus were too intelligent and too vocal to be bribed. Guggenheim was too moral. More importantly, they had the money to stop the Fed. Astor alone had more capital than some small nations. Straus owned Macy's and had massive political influence over the American middle class. Guggenheim controlled the core mineral resources. Together, they formed a triad of resistance that could have swayed public and congressional opinion, keeping America free from the debt-based economy that Jekyll Island intended to install. As long as those three men breathed, the founders of the Fed could not win. They were the old guard. They were the titans who had to die. John Jacob, Astor IV, the target of frequency. Let's look at the biggest target, John Jacob Astor IV. He was the richest man on the ship and potentially the world. But it wasn't just his gold they feared, it was his mind. Astor was an inventor and a close friend of Nikola Tesla. More importantly, he was the primary financier of the Wardenclyffe Tower project in Long Island. Astor was funneling millions into Tesla's vision of the ether limitless, free wireless energy for every home on the planet. This was the ultimate threat to the global energy monopoly. J.P. Morgan, who had invested in Tesla only to keep a leash on him, famously asked, "If anyone can draw power from the air, where do I put the meter?" The night Astor died, the meter was officially installed on the human race. By killing Astor, they forced humanity into a 100-year dependency on fossil fuels and metered electricity. We are paying for what should have been a birthright. They sank the Titanic to ensure you would always be a customer, never a creator. The death of Astor was the execution of free energy. Benjamin Guggenheim's moral choice. Benjamin Guggenheim was a different kind of threat. He was a resource giant. but he was also a man of immense personal integrity. He had already gone on record stating he would use his wealth to block the New World Order's financial grid. He saw the Fed not as a solution, but as a mechanism for enslavement. On the night of April 15, as the Titanic tilted into the abyss, Guggenheim didn't panic. He was seen escorting his valet and steward to the lifeboat deck, then returning to the first-class salon. He and his valet famously changed into their finest evening wear, telling a steward, "We've dressed in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." He sent a final message to his wife. "Tell her I played the game straight to the end. No woman shall be left aboard because Ben Guggenheim was a coward." This level of integrity was exactly why the founders feared him. Guggenheim would have used his mineral wealth to build a parallel economy, one that wasn't dependent on the Fed's debt. He was too moral to be controlled. His integrity was a weapon they had to neutralize. They didn't just kill him. They made his gentleman persona a story to distract you from the tactical reality. Guggenheim was too clean to survive their new, dirty financial world. Isidor Straus, the voice of the middle class. Isidor Straus, the owner of Macy's, was the third pillar of resistance. While Astor was the energy financier and Guggenheim was the resource giant, Straus was the psychological connection to the public. He was a well-respected political heavyweight whose opinion carried immense weight with the growing American middle class. Straus didn't just understand retail. He understood economics on a systemic level. He recognized Jekyll Island for what it was, a financial cartel disguised as a stability measure. Straus had the power to educate the public, to start a movement against the Fed Act. His Macy's advertising reach could sway entire states. His final act was one of shared sacrifice. While offered a place in a lifeboat, Straus refused to go before the women and children. His wife, Ida, also refused, telling him, "We have lived together for many years. Where you go, I go." They sat in deck chairs and watched the ocean rise. It was a beautiful, haunting sacrifice, but it was also the removal of the only man who could have exposed Jekyll Island to the average American worker. Straus's death silenced the only legitimate voice that could have rallied the people against the debt system. 1913, birth of the cartel. With the three obstacle men at the bottom of the sea, the path was clear. The founders of Jekyll Island had won the Cold War of North America. There was no one left who could expose the treasonous transfer of the U.S. monetary power to a private, non-governmental entity. On the 23rd of December, 1913, while most of Congress was home for Christmas, just like they had planned, the Federal Reserve Act was forced through. America lost the right to print its own currency. The power was handed to a private group of bankers who would then loan the currency to the U.S. government, carrying interest. Debt became the primary product of the American economy. Scarcity was installed as the operating system for the planet. The age of free energy was executed with Astor. The age of financial integrity was drowned with Guggenheim. The age of the informed middle class was ended with Straus. 1913 was the silent coup that finalized the reset of 1816. The Titanic was the controllado demolition that cleared the ground for the Federal Reserve matrix, the Olympic swap, the insurance fraud of the century. To execute a hit this massive, you don't just sink a brand new $7.5 million ship. That would be bad business. Instead, you perform a switcheroo. J.P. Morgan had a massive liability on his hands, the RMS Olympic. A year before the Titanic's maiden voyage, the Olympic, the Titanic's near-identical twin, was involved in a catastrophic collision with the British warship HMS Hawke. The impact warped the Olympic's central frame and twisted its keel. In the world of maritime insurance, the Olympic was a total loss. Morgan's company, IMM, was facing a financial disaster. They couldn't get insurance to pay because the Olympic was at fault. So, they devised a masterpiece of corporate fraud. They brought both ships into the Harland and Wolff shipyard at the same time. Under the cover of repairs, they swapped the nameplates. They swapped the lifeboats. They swapped the stationery in the cabins. The ship that left Southampton on the 10th of April 1912 was not the brand new Titanic, hull 400. It was the crippled, structurally compromised Olympic, hull 401. This explains why the Titanic struggled to maintain speed and why it sat slightly lower in the water. They didn't just want to kill the three obstacles. They wanted to collect a massive insurance payout on a ship that was already destined for the scrap heap. The unsinkable ship was a pre-packaged insurance claim. Hull 401, the smoking gun under the mud. Modern history tries to bury the physical evidence, but the ocean floor doesn't lie. When Robert Ballard discovered the wreck in 1985, forensic analysts noticed something impossible. The Titanic was supposed to have a specific configuration of portholes on its sea deck. The Olympic had a different configuration. Photographic evidence from the wreck shows the Olympic's porthole layout, not the Titanic's. Even more damning, when divers examined the propellers of the sunken ship, they didn't find the number 400. They found the number 401, the serial number for the Olympic. Why would a brand new ship have the propellers of its older, broken sister? It wouldn't, unless it was that sister. The ship at the bottom of the Atlantic is a ghost in a stolen dress. They sent the crippled ship into the ice fields because they knew it wouldn't survive even a minor impact. The iceberg didn't sink the Titanic. The founders sent a broken ship to do a job it was never meant to finish. The SS Californian, the executioner's witness. Less than 19 miles away from the sinking Titanic sat the SS Californian. It was stopped in the ice, its engines off, waiting for morning. Its captain, Stanley Lord, watched the Titanic sink for over 2 hours. He saw the rockets. He saw the lights tilt into the black water. And he did absolutely nothing. Mainstream history calls Captain Lord a coward. But look at the ownership. The SS Californian was owned by, you guessed it, J.P. Morgan's IMM. It was there as a safety net, but only for those in the know. The Californian had no passengers on board. It was carrying only 3,000 wool sweaters and blankets. It was a dedicated rescue vessel that was ordered to stay silent. When the flares went up, the Californian's crew begged the captain to respond. He refused. He claimed he wasn't sure what the flares meant. This wasn't incompetence. It was compliance. The orders had changed. The project required a total wipeout of the first-class deck. The Californian sat still and watched 1,500 people scream and die because the founders needed to ensure there were no witnesses to the execution of Astor and Straus. The Californian wasn't a failed rescuer. It was the cleanup crew that was told to stay in the garage. The white flare anomaly, the coded silence. Under international maritime law in 1912, distress signals were standardized. If you were sinking, you fired red flares. Red means SOS. Red means come now or we die. But the Titanic fired white flares. White flares were used for identification, for celebrations, or to signal a ship's position during a festive gathering. To any ship watching from a distance like the Californian or the Mount Temple, white flares signaled, "We are having a party. Everything is fine." Who ordered the use of white flares? This wasn't a mistake. The Titanic's officers were veterans. They knew the code. The use of white flares was a tactical decision to ensure that no nearby ships would interfere with the controlled sinking. It gave the founders the perfect plausible deniability. When the flares in tactical, Senate hearings asked why no one came to help. The answer was, they thought we were celebrating. They turned a massacre into a misunderstood fireworks display. The iceberg as a controlled demolition. Geologists and shipwrights have long questioned the iceberg narrative. Steel of that grade, even in 1912, doesn't tear like paper when it hits ice. It dents, it buckles. But survivors reported hearing a series of massive explosions deep within the hull before the ship even hit the ice. They described the sound of heavy machinery being torn apart. In the Tartarian forensic model, the iceberg was the cover story. The actual sinking was likely a controlled demolition from the inside. By detonating small strategic charges along the weak keel of the swapped Olympic, they ensured the ship would flood faster than its pumps could handle. The iceberg provided the visual reason, but the explosives provided the result. They needed to make sure that ship went down, and they couldn't leave it to the chance of a natural collision. The Titanic didn't just hit an iceberg. It was scuttled. The Smithsonian of the sea, the media blackout. Within hours of the sinking, the founders took control of the narrative. J.P. Morgan's friends at the New York Times and the London Times began churning out the story we know today. They focused on the heroism of the crew. They focused on the tragedy of the band playing until the end. This is a classic psychological distraction technique. By making the public cry over the musicians, they prevented them from asking why the three most powerful anti-Fed billionaires were dead. The Senate inquiry was a sham. It was headed by William Alden Smith, a man with deep ties to the banking elite. They interviewed the survivors, but they suppressed any testimony regarding the explosions, the white flares, or the ship's structural swap. They buried the truth under a mountain of human interest stories. The Titanic became a myth to prevent it from being investigated as a crime. By the morning of April 16, the obstacles were gone. John Jacob Astor IV, the man who would have funded Tesla's free energy world, was a frozen body in the Atlantic. Isidor Straus, the man who would have warned the middle class about the Fed, was gone. Benjamin Guggenheim, the man of integrity, was silenced. The power vacuum in the American financial world was absolute. There was no one left with enough capital or enough balls to challenge J.P. Morgan and the Rockefeller-Rothschild alliance. The world changed that morning. We transitioned from an era of possibility to an era of predetermination. The founders didn't just win a business deal, they conquered the timeline of the 20th century. The Christmas coup of 1913. With the three obstacles resting at the bottom of the Atlantic, the battlefield was empty. The bankers didn't wait long. In late December 1913, while the American public was distracted by Christmas preparations and most of Congress had already left Washington for the holidays, a skeleton crew of lawmakers stayed behind. On December 23, the Federal Reserve Act was forced through a nearly empty Senate. President Woodrow Wilson, a man deeply indebted to the banking elite who funded his campaign, signed it into law immediately. Years later, on his deathbed, Wilson would allegedly express deep regret, saying, "I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is now controlled by its system of credit." But the damage was done. The founders of Jekyll Island had achieved the impossible. They had privatized the currency of the United States. From that moment on, the U.S. government no longer owned its money. It had to borrow every single dollar from a private cartel at interest. This was the birth of the debt slave system. Every war, every highway, and every school built after 1913 was funded by money that didn't exist, creating a debt that could never, by design, be paid back. The execution of the ether. The Titanic didn't just sink a ship, it sank a future. As soon as the news of J.J. Astor's death reached the shore, J.P. Morgan moved to finalize the destruction of Nikola Tesla. Morgan withdrew every cent of funding for the Wardenclyffe Tower. He used his influence to ensure that no other bank or investor would touch Tesla's insane project. The plan for free, wireless energy, the very thing Astor was willing to fund with his billions, was declared a national security threat. In reality, it was a threat to the balance sheets of the Morgan and Rockefeller oil and electricity monopolies. In 1917, while the world was distracted by the First Great War, another conflict funded by the new Federal Reserve, the Wardenclyffe Tower was dynamited and sold for scrap metal. The meter was officially installed on humanity. We were forced back into the age of burning rocks, coal, oil, and gas. The founders ensured that we would remain in a state of energy scarcity, forever paying for a resource that Tesla proved was as free as the air we breathe. The Titanic was the anchor that dragged the age of light down into the depths of the age of debt, the Rockefeller replacement. With Tesla out of the way and the banking system secured, the founders moved to the next phase, the biological reset. John D. Rockefeller, a key ally in the Fed conspiracy, began funneling millions into the General Education Board. They didn't want a nation of thinkers like Astor or Straus. They wanted a nation of workers. They rewrote the history books to remove the mention of Tartaria, the star forts, and the free energy world of the 1800s. They replaced natural medicine with petroleum-based pharmaceuticals. They created a curriculum designed to produce obedient employees who would never question why they were born into debt or why their unsinkable ship really sank. The American middle class, which Isidor Straus had fought to protect, was slowly transformed into a consumer class. Every aspect of our lives, from the food we eat to the money we spend, was now under the control of the very cartel that watched the Titanic disappear from the surface of the water. The modern matrix, debt as religion. Look around you today. The system created in 1913 is the invisible cage we all live in. The US dollar has lost over 96% of its value since the Titanic sank. We are working longer hours for less value to pay for a lifestyle that is funded by credit cards, another layer of the debt matrix. Every economic crash is a harvest. The Fed raises interest rates, the economy slows down, and the big banks foreclose on the property and assets of the people. They are not managing the economy, they are farming it. They are the descendants of the men who stood on the deck of the Carpathia and watched the survivors arrive, knowing they had won the world. We are still living in the shadow of the 15th of April, 1912. The Titanic was the sacrifice required to build this temple of debt. It was the controlled demolition that allowed them to clear the site for the global financial skyscraper we are all trapped in today. The Tartarian frequency rises. But the founders made one mistake. They thought they could bury the truth in the deep ocean forever. They thought the reset was permanent. But truth has a frequency. It vibrates through the lies. It vibrates through the mud flood soil covering our cities. It vibrates through the rusted hull of the Titanic. People are waking up. We are looking at the Olympic swap. We are looking at the white flare anomaly. We are looking at the death of J.J. Astor, not as a tragedy, but as a forensic clue. The matrix is cracking because we are starting to remember who we are. We are the descendants of a civilization that didn't need meters. We are the children of a world that understood the ether. The Federal Reserve System is a parasitic overlay on a magnificent free energy reality, and once you see the parasite, it loses its power over you. The final call to action. The Titanic still sits in the dark, but the lights are coming back on in our minds. This isn't just history. This is your life. Every time you pay a bill, every time you work a job you hate to pay off a loan for a car you don't need, remember the ship. Remember the men who were murdered to make you a customer. The founders want you to be afraid. They want you to think the iceberg is coming for you next. But the iceberg was a lie. The only thing unsinkable in this world is the human spirit and the hunger for truth. It's time to stop mourning the victims and start reclaiming the technology they died to protect. Decalcify your mind. Reconnect with the frequency of the earth. Stop feeding the debt monster. The ship is at the bottom, but we are still here. The reset is failing. The eye is closing, and the truth is rising to the surface. Welcome to the end of the deception. Welcome to the beginning of the great return. I am Hidden Era, and this is the end of the Titanic Files. But for you, the investigation is just beginning. Stay curious, stay awake, and never trust the official story.